Some time ago, I uploaded my video essay about what I believed was the worst narrative mistake of Star Trek Generations. I didn't realize that I posted it around the time of the movie's 30th anniversary. It wasn't even the video I had initially planned to upload that week, just the one that I was able to finish in time. Now that it was out, I told myself that I wouldn't think about that movie or any of its implications anymore after that. Only at the end of the day I posted that video, and when I was about to go to bed, was my attention directed to this short film, which had been posted only a day or so before. I'll link it in the description in case you haven't seen it yet. The short film, titled 765874 Unification, tells a story which provides closure to the events of Generations. It was created by the Roddenberry Archive, which is affiliated with Gene Roddenberry's estate, with the involvement of Leonard Nimoy's estate as represented by his widow, Susan Bay Nimoy. The film features some actual Star Trek actors reprising their roles, most notably William Shatner as Captain Kirk, and Robin Curtis, who played Saavik in Star Trek III The Search for Spock and Star Trek IV The Voyage Home, as well as Gary Lockwood, who played Gary Mitchell in the second Star Trek pilot Where No Man Has Gone Before. Certain computer generation technology was used to make Shatner look the same age he and his character did when Generations was released, and practical effects made Spock appear as he did when played by Leonard Nimoy. Since the film has very little dialogue, at points it's a bit hard to tell what's supposed to be happening, and understanding some of its events requires context from certain Star Trek media. The sequence of numbers in the title is the Starfleet personnel number of Yeoman J.M. Colt, who appeared in Star Trek's first ever pilot, The Cage. In Star Trek Picard, in the year 2401, we see that James Kirk's corpse is held in stasis at the Daystrom Institute and is the subject of an initiative called Project Phoenix. A previous Roddenberry Archive short film, Regeneration, shows Spock, with Leonard Nimoy's face, going to Veridian 3 to retrieve Kirk's body, which explains it being in the Daystrom Institute as opposed to being left on that planet. In Season 3 of Star Trek Discovery, set in the 32nd century, we learn about Yor, a Betelgeusian Starfleet officer who crossed over from the Kelvin timeline during the late 24th century. As for the events of this film, we first see Gary Mitchell with a wall of energy behind him. Yeoman J.M. Colt also makes an appearance. Then we see that Kirk has been successfully resurrected by Project Phoenix. He meets a group of people at a fountain, including an elderly Saavik. He then goes to Yor, who gives him something that appears to let him voluntarily enter the Kelvin timeline. In doing so, he sees illusions of his past selves, first as a captain and then as an admiral. Kirk then appears in a bedroom occupied by Spock Prime on New Vulcan. On the bedside table are objects which would be bequeathed to the alternate reality Spock once Spock Prime had passed away in Star Trek Beyond, and Spock Prime himself appears to be on his deathbed. Kirk approaches the bed and takes the sleeping Spock's hand, who awakens, sees him, and holds Kirk's hands in return. The two watch a sunset out the window as the film ends. Okay, there's a lot to unpack here. The director did provide a breakdown, which I'll be referring to here, and he said that the events of the film were deliberately left open to interpretation by viewers. First, I'll address the issue of computer generation and AI software in making the characters' faces look as they appear in the film. There are certainly a lot of ethics and nuance when it comes to the use of AI in creating art. However, this film was the work and input of humans. All the software did was de-age and augment Shatner's and Lockwood's faces. For Spock's actor, it was almost all practical effects. This project was also done with the permission of everyone involved or those closest to them. Much of what happens in the film isn't exactly explained by the film itself, and instead had to be clarified by the director. People were asking questions like, what connection do Gary Mitchell and J.M. Colt have to the events of this film? What exactly was supposed to have been happening to Kirk as he was transported to the Kelvin timeline? Was it to represent how the Kelvin timeline was itself created by going backwards in time? Also, is Kirk supposed to have just appeared right where Spock happened to be? Either way, how did he end up there? Kirk Prime is not present during the events of Star Trek Beyond, so did he return to the Prime universe after Spock died? The presence of Saavik also has its implications. In some of the Star Trek novels, Vulcan's Heart, Spock actually marries Saavik. She is supposed to be Spock's wife in the events of this film, and the younger Vulcan man standing next to her is her and Spock's son, Sorak. The question then comes up as to when that child was conceived, because a potential plotline for Star Trek IV, which was thankfully discarded, is that the interaction between Saavik and the regenerated, mindless Spock when the latter was going through Pon farr resulted in Saavik getting pregnant. Yeah. Let's all thank Leonard Nimoy for being the one to save us from that. However, their son here was most likely conceived following their marriage. Even at the time Vulcan's Heart was published, there was questioning of why Spock would marry Saavik when her relationship with Spock as depicted in the movies is something more like that of father and daughter. Mentor and student. One comic even establishes that Saavik was raised by Sarek and Amanda after Spock finds her abandoned as a young child, which would actually make her his sister the same way Michael Burnham is. Side note, if that were the case, Saavik would likely have met Michael, since this would be well before Michael made her one-way trip to the 32nd century. The novels making her Spock's wife was probably done to answer the question of who Picard said he witnessed Sarek's son marry, and how Spock would resolve his Pon farr cycles. The former of those reasons feels like an example of Trek trying a little too hard to make everything canon congruent, similar to Discovery's finale going well out of its way to line up with the story of the Calypso Short Treks episode. Spock and Saavik may not have actually shared romantic attraction, but instead married out of tradition, sentiment, or Saavik not wanting Spock to be alone all his life in the absence of Kirk. The interaction during the regenerated Spock's Pon farr may also have formed some kind of connection between them, though I'm not sure how you form a mental connection with an essentially mindless being. There is rumored to be some unreleased Roddenberry archive-made footage of a wedding ceremony between Spock and Saavik, so the filmmakers may have wanted to integrate that storyline into the Unification short film. I really can't see Spock marrying anyone out of romantic love other than Kirk, but Picard being there for that wouldn't have been possible in what is considered to be official canon, since even though it hadn't yet been written when the episode in which Picard mentions the wedding aired, Kirk was lost in the Nexus during that time. Back to the film, it was supposedly made to celebrate the 30th anniversary of Star Trek Generations, which is funny to me because it basically gives that movie's finale the middle finger, something that was a long time coming in my opinion. This is also not the first Star Trek tie-in media to fix Generations. Shatner actually wrote an extensive series of novels about Kirk being resurrected and continuing to live out his life in the 24th century, as I mentioned in my video. This film seems to take place in at least the early 25th century, as Kirk's body is still at the Daystrom Institute at the turn of the 24th into the 25th century, as depicted in Star Trek Picard. Some have suggested that the garden Kirk is seen in is the one aboard the Enterprise J from the 26th century, though it's doubtful that Saavik would live that long. The typical lifespan of full Vulcans is around 200 years, so with her having been born in the 23rd century, she'd likely die of old age sometime in the 25th century. I suppose it's also possible that the Enterprise J's garden was simply based on a real one, and this is that real one. Either way, enough time would have passed in the Kelvin timeline that Spock would have already passed away, indicating that Kirk has to go backwards in time within the Kelvin timeline to be with Spock. I've also mentioned how there were multiple ways Generations' ending could have been retroactively fixed, so I wondered why the film went with its story specifically. As I said in the other video, my preference would be that when Kirk is resurrected, he goes through the Guardian of Forever to live out the years he missed with Spock, McCoy, and everyone else. I do, however, definitely like the idea that Spock did not die alone and that Kirk was with him in his final moments to put Spock at peace by getting to see Kirk one last time. Part of me still only considers this a partial fix-it, as the resurrected Kirk will now live out the rest of his life without Spock, just like Spock did without him, so it still feels like burying the gays in a way. However, another part of me knows I should take what I can get. Reminds me of a quote I read in a book once: "One does not question miracles or complain that they are not constructed perfectly to one's liking." More than anything though, I still wish Star Trek VI had just been the end of Kirk's story, and that the events of Generations could just be negated or even ignored altogether. Either way, this story does leave some possibilities still open. Kirk could still return to the Prime Universe and go through the Guardian of Forever, as I mentioned. Doing that would still make Kirk unable to be there for Spock's final moments, since those take place in a different reality that Kirk does not initially follow Spock into, so he would still want to do what he does in this film, even if he would otherwise get to live out his life with Spock. Since Kirk and Spock are able to touch one another at the moment of Spock's death, Spock could even give Kirk his Katra. Once Kirk returned to the Prime Universe, the Katra could be stored in an ark, or Kirk could keep it in his mind so that he and Spock can always be together for the rest of his life. I think there's another reason the film's particular story was chosen, because it gave William Shatner in particular a certain kind of closure. He was not only getting closure for the ending of Star Trek Generations, which he had always been dissatisfied with, but it might have felt to him like getting closure regarding his relationship with Leonard Nimoy. Despite their lifelong friendship, Shatner and Nimoy had a falling out shortly before Nimoy's death that sadly wasn't able to be resolved before it was too late. By seeing his character get to be with Spock during Spock's final moments, perhaps it allowed Shatner to imagine himself as having been with Nimoy during Nimoy's final moments. At Shatner's age, seeking closure for anything is definitely a worthwhile pursuit. The film is dedicated to Leonard Nimoy, and as I mentioned in my Generations video, he too was very much against Generations storytelling and especially the ending, so the making of the Unification film was likely in part to resolve the story on his behalf, not just Shatner's. Here's a question that I'm sure is on everyone's mind: is this short film to be considered canon? The filmmakers did have the permission to use the characters, setting, and audio that they did, but since its production was not directly by Paramount, it isn't alpha canon unless they say so, or otherwise integrated into primary canon somehow. It's definitely beta canon though, just like all Star Trek books are. Maybe Shatner just thought that getting to see a resolution to Generations' finale on screen was more substantial than reading or writing it in a book. Even though the film wasn't made with the intention of being part of canon, the people at Paramount who are currently in charge of Star Trek, such as Alex Kurtzman, could step in and declare the film as canon if they wanted to, possibly even arranging for an official release of the film as a certified Star Trek property. Another question people have brought up is whether this short film makes a romantic relationship, or at least romantic attraction, between Kirk and Spock canon. Well, nothing seems to be made explicit regarding that. They aren't doing a Vulcan finger kiss, for example, but then again, nothing ever was in the original series or movies either. The film was probably meant to leave that open to interpretation, just as all previous Star Trek media has. Either way, it is special that Spock gets to be reunited with the most meaningful person from his life, even if only for a fleeting moment. Kirk being considered to be be the most important person in Spock's life over the woman he married does imply some things, but Saavik had been with Spock for many years, whereas Spock had spent so many years without Kirk up until his death, so they wanted Kirk to be the one to be with him in that moment. Let's examine the scene with Kirk's past selves. It seems that his younger self in the gold uniform is trying to save Spock's life like he always does. Kirk, as he appears in the red uniform, represents him being unable to save Spock in the Wrath of Khan, and Kirk's present self is then able to accept that he also can't save Spock's life now, but he doesn't have to. He just wants to be there for him one last time. The past doesn't matter, only the present. In Spock's words, what happened before no longer exists. When Kirk and Spock are together again one last time, the past 100 years that Spock spent without him are not to be mourned for. It also represents how the amount of Spock's life he spent with Kirk, though small compared to the rest, was the part that meant the most to him, and he carried his memories of Kirk with him until the very end. Of course, the hand-holding is intentionally reminiscent of the sickbay scene from Star Trek The Motion Picture. The reunion scene also made me think of Michael's final piece of advice to her brother Spock: find that person who seems farthest from you, reach for them, and let them guide you. When Kirk extended his hand to Spock in that scene, Spock took it. I imagine that Kirk Prime was the person who seemed farthest from him, and Spock let Kirk guide him through his final moments of life. On the surface, it may have seemed uncharacteristic of Spock to turn away from Kirk so soon after seeing him again, but by turning towards the sunset, he was signaling to Kirk that he wanted the two of them to share that experience, and they do. The sunset is symbolic, of course. The end of one day will soon transition into the beginning of another. Even this isn't the end for the two of them. As for the connection to Gary Mitchell, he is shown shortly before the Project Phoenix graphics, so it's possible that he lent his power or knowledge to Project Phoenix in order to make it work. He may have never actually died, come back to life using his power, or he did what he did from within the afterlife since he could somehow sense that Kirk's spirit was lost without Spock. I think the energy wall behind Gary is supposed to be the galactic barrier, the thing that gave him his powers. These actions are very noble of Gary, considering Kirk is the person who killed him. Perhaps his death gave him the time and space for some needed self-reflection, and he's grateful to Kirk for giving him that. J.M. Colt's appearance, according to the writer, is apparently a reference to a Star Trek comic where she goes outside of time and sees the Prime Universe as well as other universes' timelines from an outside perspective. She is seen in the lab where Project Phoenix is underway, as well as in several other scenes and locations, so it's very likely that she, possibly with Gary Mitchell's assistance, helped put all of the events into place that led to Kirk coming back. There's another thing I want to address here, the implications of this film's story if there is in fact an afterlife in the Star Trek universe. Personally, Spock Prime's death in Star Trek Beyond actually made me a little happy rather than sad, because I imagined it to mean that Spock and Kirk Prime would be reunited in the afterlife. If Kirk was resurrected, as in this film, he would have been dead for a good amount of time before he was brought back. Would he remember the afterlife, including being with Spock there? I still think he'd want to utilize the opportunity to be with Spock one more time in life, which he didn't get to do as much as he'd have liked, in addition to being with him in the afterlife. Either way, even if Kirk Prime has to live out the rest of his post-resurrection life without Spock, he'll eventually be reunited with him in the afterlife once again at some point. After all, Kirk did say, if there's even a chance that Spock has an eternal soul, then it's my responsibility, as surely as if it were my very own. I've also seen different interpretations of the film which view it as taking place at least partially or even entirely within the afterlife, which the writer did say is one of many valid interpretations of the film's events. It's possible that neither Kirk nor Spock could find peace when they died because they were both separated from one another upon their respective deaths. Kirk's spirit may have spent the last 20 or 30 years between between his death and resurrection through Project Phoenix in some sort of purgatory, and the scene where he appears to be in some transitional space accompanied by his past selves is likely a callback to that time. Before he can move on, he must let go of his past. Of course, in real life it has been 30 years since Generations, and its unsatisfying supposed ending for Kirk, which left many fans feeling like the story was unresolved and in a state of limbo. The item which Yor gives Kirk that allows him to find Spock appears to be his badge, recovered from Viridian along with his body, and it's once he puts the badge back on that he finds Spock. The badge represents the connection Kirk has to Spock, the two having met one another and grown close through their joint service in Starfleet. It was likely also Spock who retrieved the badge as per the Regeneration short film. Even though Kirk was just brought back to life, it could very well be that once Spock passes on, Kirk will do so at the same time so that they both can be together as they die, like it was always meant to be, and they will simultaneously enter the afterlife where they will be together for all eternity, never to be separated again. It's possible that Project Phoenix is only able to resurrect Kirk temporarily anyway, and visiting Spock's deathbed is just what he chooses to do with the limited time he's given. This final moment between Kirk and Spock is able to happen because of multiple times they have both come back for one another. When Spock sacrificed himself to save the Enterprise, Kirk and his crew retrieved his body and reunited it with his Katra to restore him to life. As we see in the Regeneration short film, Spock similarly comes back for Kirk's body after Kirk's death so that Project Phoenix can work on a way to bring him back to life. And now Kirk has come back for Spock once again to be with him as he passes on. Once resurrected, Kirk finds his way to Spock across time, space, and reality because the two have an unbreakable connection, their very souls being intertwined. Kirk's death on Viridian and Spock's on New Vulcan happened at separate times, but the two were meant to have died together, and once the conditions are met for that to happen, they can both peacefully move on together. Or it could be that Kirk has been dead this whole time and has been able to leave the afterlife long enough to be with Spock when he dies and guide his soul to the afterlife with him. I definitely like this interpretation better than the one of Kirk coming back to life and finding Spock, only for it to be the moment of Spock's death and yet another instance of the two being separated. No matter the surrounding circumstances, though, the focus of the film is the moment when Kirk and Spock are together again, and I think they did a good job with that scene in particular. Anyway, that's just about all of my thoughts on the Star Trek Unification short film. Like with any aspect of Star Trek, canon or non-canon, we can accept any parts of it that we like and ignore any parts that we don't. As for me, I wouldn't consider it canon because that would mean taking the events of Generations as canon, which I will never do. I also don't accept any sexual relationship between Spock and Saavik as canon. Talking about the Unification short film here has kind of become an extension of getting my thoughts about Generations off my chest. However, I will say that the film having been made with the involvement of Star Trek actors and the Roddenberry archive opens up the possibility of more such media being made in the future, maybe with some that explores the story of Unification some more, and I would be curious as to where they could go with that. What do you think of Star Trek Unification? Do you agree with any of my thoughts or interpretations? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching this video. I've got more on Star Trek aside from just the Generations video that you can check out if you want, and even more videos on countless other topics. Live long and prosper, and I'll see you next time.